Welcome to the Roy Morgan Weekly Update. In a week where Treasurer Jim Chalmers confirmed there would be changes to the tax on superannuation balances over $3 million, the Albanese government's vote declined for a second straight week, although they still hold a large lead. Support for the Albanese government was down 2% to 54.5%, still clearly ahead of the coalition on only 45.5% on a two-party preferred basis. Consumer confidence has barely moved. It's down just 0.1. The ANZ Roy Morgan Consumer Confidence Rating was 79.9 before the RBA meets today to raise interest rates for a record 10th month in a row. Consumer confidence has been hovering around or below 80 for a dangerously long time now. Government confidence was also virtually unchanged at 96, with more Australians saying the country is heading in the wrong direction, 44%, than in the right direction, 40%. Inflation expectations were also unchanged this week at 5.2%. Last week, the ABS released the January CPI, their first official inflation numbers for 2023, showing annual inflation at 7.4%. Now, although this is still high, it's substantially down from the peak of 8.4% reached in December. Roy Morgan's inflation expectations indicator, based on what Australians expect inflation to be, has been predicting inflation to fall since it peaked at 6.8% in early November. Once again, it's proven useful as a leading indicator of actual inflation. Now to employment and unemployment. At face value, the latest Roy Morgan employment estimates show good news. From February, employment increased with full-time employment hitting a record high of almost 9 million, while unemployment was down. Unemployment was down 0.6% in the month to 10.1%, and underemployment was also down by 0.4% to 9.1%. But if we look beyond the headline figures and the month-to-month movements and instead focus on the broader context, workforce trends over the past year as we emerge from pandemic restrictions present an interesting picture. Compared to a year ago, everything in the Australian workforce is up. We see a large increase in employment, over 300,000 more people actually in jobs. And in what seems counterintuitive, unemployment also increased, almost as much as employment. So unemployment was up by 294,000 from a year ago. Essentially, the workforce, which is defined as people who are employed or looking for work, the workforce has increased by nearly 600,000 since February 2022. Unsurprisingly, employment and unemployment are complicated, and there are competing factors at play, but the big one is immigration. With immigration returning after the pandemic, people are entering Australia in record numbers. The population of Australia increased by more than 500,000 in the last year alone, clearly impacting the employment numbers. The mandatory COVID restrictions and COVID isolation payments that kept people from work ended in October 2022, so workers had to return to work. But overall, the Australian workforce is growing rapidly and there are many new jobs being created. However, there are simply not enough jobs for all those wanting to work, hence the increases in unemployment and underemployment. And finally this week, turning to the New South Wales state election in just over 2 weeks. A special Roy Morgan SMS poll conducted last week showed the opposition Labor Party on 52.5%, up 0.5% since January, continuing its lead over the Liberal National Coalition on 47.5% on a two-party preferred basis. Now, given the margins in key seats around New South Wales, if this result were repeated at the election, we'd likely end up with a hung parliament, and Chris Minns' Labor Party favoured to form a minority government. However, the final call for nominations is this week, and we'll have a full picture of all the candidates standing at the election only in the next few days. This is really important as some of the parties polling well now are not expected to stand candidates in many seats, and this will have an impact on preference flows and voting decisions around the state. So stay tuned. Consumer confidence in New South Wales is low at only 80.2. And remember, 100 means you've got the same number of people positive and negative. So 80.2 is low. And that's down 2.6 points from a week ago. The low consumer confidence is clearly a factor that favours the opposition and a potential change in government. In terms of approval, 53% of New South Wales electors approve of the job Perrottet is doing as Premier, 47% disapprove. However, in a head-to-head comparison with opposition leader, a majority of electors say that Minns would make the better Premier, 54%, compared to 46% who say Perrottet would be the better Premier. Now, trust, and particularly distrust, played a significant role in the re-election of the Andrews Labor government in Victoria. On Monday week, we at Roy Morgan will review the landscape of trust and distrust in New South Wales in a special New South Wales pre-election webinar. And that's a wrap for this week. Subscribe free to our Roy Morgan YouTube channel for all the latest political, economic and market research data and insights. Thanks for listening today, and I look forward to bringing you the latest on consumer confidence, inflation expectations and voting intentions again next week, which will show the impact from today's Reserve Bank decision on interest rates. Take care and see you next Tuesday.